Pokemon Colosseum is a game that's very near and dear to my heart. Calling the game well made and polished, though, would be a massive stretch. This isn't me calling the game bad either. In fact, it being so janky is exactly why I love it so much. There's fun to be had in a janky game like this. For a very similar reason, Super Mario Sunshine is one of my all-time favorite video games. So today we're going to go over some of the janky parts of Pokemon Colosseum. This isn't all glitches, as sometimes simple game mechanics are just janky themselves. Not all of these are necessarily going to be helpful either, or even good. As with a janky game like this, you gotta expect to take the bad with the good. To start things off here, we're gonna cover some of the most infamous ones that everyone knows quickly just so that they're out of the way. As I've already shown in the intro, for some reason Pokemon using Fly switch in and out of their flying animations while airborne for seemingly no reason. In combination with grounded Pokemon who fly in their idle animations being way higher off the ground than they really should be, occasionally it gets slightly confusing if you're not paying full attention to the game, but this is mostly just a minor visual bug. To show exactly how confusing this can get though, I want to hold a little quiz. Here out of the 4 Pokemon in this screenshot, how many of them are currently using Fly? Leave your answer in the comments below and I'll pin the first correct answer. Next up is the famous Infinite Master Ball glitch, or just the Infinite Balls glitch, as some people don't realize this works with every type of Pokeball in the game. To do this, it's as simple as using a Pokeball with your first Pokemon for the turn, then switching the bag slot of the Pokeball for the second Pokemon of the turn. For some reason, this prevents the Pokeball from being taken out of the bag, which makes this almost certainly the single most useful glitch in the game. And of course, the last of the infamous bits of jank is Jumpluff Square Shadows. I don't have a lot to add here, it's mostly just infamous because Skiploom is one of the first Shadow Pokemon you get access to, so a lot of people just run into it playing normally when they purify their Skiplooms. It's similar to the whole Fly animations jank thing, where that one's pretty prevalent due to several Shadow Pokemon and regular NPCs having Pokemon with Fly. I was gonna go and check every Pokemon with spheres on its body for Square Shadows to see if this was exclusive to Jumpluff, but this video ended up being super behind schedule as is, so maybe if enough is down for a second Colo jank video, I'll look into it then. A lot of people probably know about this next one as well, but I personally wouldn't call it infamous, and that would be how shiny Pokemon in this game work. In Pokemon Colosseum, every Pokemon in the game is supposed to be shiny locked, and for the non-Shadow Pokemon, that seems to work just fine, as they only ever have one trainer ID associated with them. For the Shadow Pokemon though, things seem to work a bit differently. The game attempts to shiny lock a Shadow Pokemon when it's first thrown out into battle by its first trainer, by using that trainer's ID and Secret ID, which are for some reason also randomly generated when you battle one of the NPC trainers instead of just using the player's IDs. When you go ahead and snag a Shadow Pokemon, or just end the battle after it's been thrown out into battle, either by winning or losing that battle, everything about that Shadow Pokemon is locked in, meaning that it won't try and generate the Pokemon again. So if you either rematch the NPC, or your trainer IDs would make that Pokemon's PID shiny, the Shadow Pokemon will be shiny. Unfortunately, if it does end up with the rematch having the Pokemon shiny, that doesn't necessarily mean it'll stay shiny when you snag it either, as it's effectively another 1 in 8,192 chance of your trainer ID also making that Pokemon shiny. The result of this mess of a system though, is that either a non-shiny Pokemon effectively turns into a shiny Pokemon, or a shiny Pokemon effectively turns into a non-shiny Pokemon when you snag them. This next one's minor and incredibly fucking stupid. Let's say you have a Pokemon that's about to faint by poison after a battle, and you let that Pokemon faint instead of using an item to heal the status. For example, you didn't have a full heal on hand, and you figure you're just gonna revive it instead. That isn't a very viable strategy in Pokemon Colosseum, because if a Pokemon faints by poison in the overworld, when it's revived, it comes back still poisoned. While I'm sure the Guts users love this oversight, I don't think I need to explain why this is weird to anyone who plays these games. Speaking of minor and stupid jank, this one's a typo which is probably related to the move in question being unreleased at the time Colosseum came out, but if you transfer in a Pokemon who knows the move Frenzy Plant, you might notice something a bit off about the name. As you can see, instead of Frenzy Plant, I apparently know a move called Solid Plant instead. It's good to know that the plants are structurally sound, I suppose, but I guess this move was going for a rebrand here to seem not as chaotic? Jokes aside, this is a more accurate translation of the move's name in Japanese, and seeing as the move wasn't even obtainable yet, as the only ways to get it in Generation 3 are on Kanto starter Pokemon and the Johto starters from Mount Battle and XD, it's understandable how this got missed. Speedrunners also use another bit of jank that's well known to them and not too many casuals, that being an oversight that allows you to use an X item on the other Pokemon you have out. So in Generation 3, if you were to use an X item, it usually forces you to use the X item on the Pokemon whose turn you're using the item on. However, if you attempt to use an item that doesn't have an effect on your other Pokemon, say for example, on your first Pokemon's turn, you use an antidote on your second Pokemon, then you use an X item, the X item doesn't apply to the Pokemon whose turn you're using, but instead the other Pokemon. This can be massive, both to just use 2 X items on the same Pokemon in one turn, or to use an X item and then immediately get to attack with the boosted stat. You know how people like to complain about the AI being able to cheat in Pokemon games? Well, I think I've stumbled into a case of the AI actually cheating in this game. Let's just say you end up with only one Pokemon left out, and you wanted to revive another Pokemon. You better hope that the AI can't one-shot the thing you're reviving, because in this game, if you were to revive a Pokemon which would then come out afterward, the AI can target it as if it was there the whole time, and that usually leads to it being O-code and having you in an even worse position. Some people have argued that this isn't a glitch, but this was patched in Pokemon XD. The AI in that game will not target the newly revived Pokemon under any circumstances. If you're wondering why I even encountered this in the first place, this and the next big section I encountered while doing a playthrough of Colosseum years ago, which I only allowed myself to use unpurified Shadow Pokemon. And you don't get very many of those at levels that match late game opponents. I didn't restrict item usage, because the game already has a system to restrict item usage for this kind of playthrough, and that system is what we're talking about next. Hyper Mode. Hyper Mode is the single reason I wanted to make this video, as it's a really cool system that goes overlooked by most people who play this game because there's not really much of a reason to use it. Hyper Mode randomly activates by taking up a turn where your Shadow Pokemon attempts to use Shadow Rush. The chances of this happening, like many other things tied to Shadow Pokemon, are based on its nature. I don't think anyone has gotten the exact rates of each nature entering Hyper Mode yet, but this is a table from a guide on speedrun.com which has the natures which are more likely to enter Hyper Mode than others, along with some numbers related to purification. This game's purification system has a lot of depth to it as well. The natures impact how much each method will empty the heart gauge. I won't go too much into it right now though, as I might talk about this more some other day. Once you're actually in Hyper Mode, most people just immediately call their Pokemon back out of it, as that gets you a chunk of the heart gauge emptied, and it disables the main drawback of Hyper Mode. That being that you can't use items on a Pokemon while it's in Hyper Mode, other than Scents, which end Hyper Mode in addition to the regular effect of lowering the heart gauge. However, there's more to Hyper Mode than just helping you purify Shadow Pokemon. People who get fed up of entering Hyper Mode and decide to just attack might end up seeing one of 2 situations play out. The first of those situations usually is seeing that Shadow Rush is suddenly critting a lot more often while Hyper Mode is active. In fact, it has a 95% crit rate while you're in Hyper Mode. This is usually seen first, as you did try and use Shadow Rush when you got put into Hyper Mode anyways. The thing less people end up seeing is what happens when you select any other move while in Hyper Mode, and this is where things start to get really fun. Most of the time when you pick a different move while in Hyper Mode, your Pokemon will do something that isn't quite what you tried to do in the first place. Instead of using the attack you tried to use, your Pokemon will more often than not decide to do one of several other things. This list of other things includes the Pokemon selfishly using another one of its moves, selfishly still using the same move, selfishly using a move but instead attacking your other Pokemon, attack either the player or the opposing trainer, be too confused to move, hit itself as if it was confused, return itself to its Pokeball, which will bypass any trapping that is currently in effect, such as Shadow Tag from this Why Not, and if there isn't a Pokemon to switch to, you'll instead get text saying the Pokemon doesn't know how to do it. The last of these effects is the Pokemon will attempt to use its held item, which even happens if you're not holding an item at the moment. This effect in particular, if it comes up, still follows the normal rules of Pokemon held items. So if you give your Pokemon a potion, it won't know how to use it and will give you text accordingly. Hey, this is salted during editing here. So basically, I did my footage recording before and after I recorded the script. So I got the footage of it failing to use an item beforehand. So I figured, okay, it failed. Obviously, it must be able to use a held item, right? So I tried many different held items, including, like, berries that make sense, like a lychee berry, a citrus berry, I couldn't once get the effect of the Pokemon using the held item to actually result in using the held item. So if anybody has any proof that this effect can actually result in using the item, please let me know. But otherwise, I am now convinced that this effect actually doesn't do anything. Thank you. Another cool thing about these effects is that they replace the turn, which seems like a bad thing, but it can be taken advantage of too. Let's say one of your Pokemon's other moves has higher priority, like Quick Attack. When you try to use Quick Attack, since the turn order is set before the effect takes place, that Pokemon's priority is taken into account, then the random Hyper Mode effect happens instead. While this is certainly niche, it could enable a small group of Shadow Pokemon to either use their held items in a crucial moment, or have a chance at using a move that could save the situation for you at a higher priority. It's a huge gamble because the effect selected is random, and the target of any move that gets picked by this is also random, but it's a cool last resort option for the Shadow Pokemon who have priority moves. The Shadow Pokemon who have a priority move before Purification are Furret and Raikou having Quick Attack, and Forretress with Protect. This also technically applies to negative priority moves, even though they'd be slightly less useful, but the ones with negative priority moves are Heracross with Counter, Makuhita with Vital Throw, and Granbull with Roar. There's one last thing that's somewhat annoying that Hyper Mode can do as well. There's a very rare chance that a Pokemon can exit Hyper Mode on its own, which happened way too many times in the final Gauntlet when I was doing that Shadow-only challenge run, and killed many attempts of Nazgore and Evis. Thankfully, this doesn't use up the turn when it happens, but it's the worst case scenario whenever it does happen, because not only does it mean you lose the crit rate of Hyper Mode for Shadow Rush, but you also don't get any of the heart gauge empty when it happens either. I'm sure this effect happening has saved someone somewhere because they couldn't afford to waste a turn on a call but needed to item their Pokemon to keep it alive next turn. But this is a real pain in the ass when it happens normally, because if you didn't call the Pokemon out, you usually wanted it to be in Hyper Mode. Either way, with all I had to say about Hyper Mode, I'm sure at least a few people watching this now would be wondering about Reverse Mode in Pokemon XD, and if that has any cool hidden effects you might not have been aware of. Unfortunately though, Reverse Mode is really uninteresting. Bulbapedia had a claim for the longest time that using non-shadow moves could cause disobedience, but that doesn't seem to be the case as I couldn't replicate this. Reverse Mode just does damage to you at the end of each turn, but it doesn't waste your turn to enter it anymore. It could still be ended by calling the Pokemon or using Ascent just like with Hyper Mode. The only interesting part of Reverse Mode is that Shadow Lugia can't enter it. This is all the jank that I'm aware of in this game that I wanted to talk about. I apologize that this took so long to get out. I've been pretty busy the past month or so with another project I've been dealing with that's unrelated to YouTube, and in addition to that, the Hyper Mode effects being random took a lot of time to get the footage I needed. The exiting Hyper Mode effect in particular really didn't want to happen while recording. I've begun work on research for part 2 of the Shiny Home Dex Challenge video now that we have the Indigo Discs, so I'm hoping I can get it out in a reasonable amount of time. Part 1 took a lot of time to make though, so this may take a while still. There's a real chance I just put something else out in the meantime if I've got the time and I'm not too busy. I thank you all for being patient with me either way, and thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time, Buzz. Take care.